Very good evening to you all. Um, so we not, yes, hello, we're working. Excuse my profanity. So this evening, I wanted to launch a new mini series called "Forgotten Colleagues," and the purpose of it is to go back in time and look through some of those scholars who have been overlooked and lost in obscurity for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because they weren't that notable at the time, sometimes because they had their hypotheses refuted in theory, but ultimately, for whatever reason, they no longer get the love and notoriety that they deserve. I wanted to start this series for two reasons. The first being a romantic reason, and the other a practical reason. The romantic reason first. I was talking to Professor Marcus Vincent, who is my supervisor for the PhD. And one of the things he said to me after I had a quite bad experience with a colleague in patristic studies, he said, "Look, there are going to be lots of people who give you stick, and you're going to face adversity if you want to break new ground in scholarship. If you want to raise controversial issues, if you want to make a change, and you're going to be on the fringe at least to start with, right? Every view or hypothesis has begun at some point on the fringe. And so he said, but we don't write necessarily for today. We write for future colleagues. We write for those who, in maybe 100 years' time, after we're dead, say, hey, maybe this guy was onto something. And I find this is true equally as much looking back in the past. And we're going to talk about William Cureton later, who's one of my heroes. But he's inspired me so much. And when he lived and he wrote, he had no idea this could happen. So I want to bring these guys back in the hope that someone might bring me back one day as a fringe scholar. And the second one, and the more important reason, is a practical thing. As colleagues of mine and I have chatted, one of the things I realised is that we live in an echo chamber. I don't mean an echo chamber like the Twitter sphere or our Instagram and all the rest of it, or even our news. What I mean is that we only read scholars that we think are noteworthy. So whether they agree with us or not, we don't choose to read small timers. I appreciate that we all have time in our day and that's finite, that's fair. But equally, we forget that actually lots of little people, little viewers, little contributors might have something to offer as well. And so by looking back at some of these past researchers, academics, professors, scholars, PhDs coming out their ears, we might stumble upon treasure, hypotheses that were refuted and destroyed, but came back under the guise of just this podcast. Who knows? But that is the reason why I've chosen to kick off with William Cureton, because he fits all of the criteria that the Forgotten Colleagues miniseries is meant to be about. He is the perfect example, and hopefully you'll see why as I go through. So before we look at maybe some of his ideas, I want to give you a brief background on the man himself. He is a fairly uninteresting figure in some senses, but hopefully as we go through, you'll see that he actually has a lot to offer. So he was born in 1808 in Shropshire in England, which is about a 3.5 hour drive from where I live in the UK. And he grew up in a relatively poor space because his father died when he was young. But being very clever, he went to the grammar school and eventually, while also having a job, he went to Oxford in 1826, where he did a BA and an MA. And as a good Christian man of the time did in England, he was then ordained in 1832 to the Church of England. And he was very lucky in some sense because he got the two dream jobs for any upcoming scholar. For many of you that know me, I might not be able to academia next year. But Cureton was very lucky in the sense that he got two jobs that were perfect. The first one was at the Bodleian Library in Oxfordshire, at Oxford University, a home of many beautiful works and volumes. And then after that, he moved to the British Museum in 1837, where he became the assistant in charge of keeping manuscripts. And so he had the ability to research and had access to all the primary sources he needed. Perhaps, though, the greatest part of any man's life was his marriage in 1843 to Harriet. As many of you know, I'm also getting married soon, so this bit speaks to me. I hope my career is as fruitful as his marriage, as he went on to have 7 children. But he didn't just mix in low circles. He eventually came up a bit higher than that and became the chaplain in ordinary in 1847 to Queen Victoria. So he was no longer an obscure grammar school attendee, a niche academic. He was someone who knew and had contacts in government and in powerful positions. And in fact, we'll see later on that this comes back to help him um, in a rather fortuitous way. So while he was doing these jobs, he learned Arabic and Syriac and a couple of other Oriental languages. And he his first publication of any note was a Syriac version of the Gospels. Now, that on the face of it wasn't that impressive, except for the fact that the Syriac version that he published was wholly different to the Peshitta, which is the famous Syriac copy of the Gospels. And he believed that in the case of particularly Matthew's Gospel, the Syriac was far closer to the Hebrew, which he thought Matthew was originally written in, than anything else that we currently had. Now, it didn't make great impacts on the scholarly community, this work, but nonetheless, it was extremely influential for him to get his first piece of work out there. And he also published some other quite influential works. Perhaps the second most, sorry, important one was the Festal Letters of Athanasius. But undoubtedly, his most important contribution to the world of academia was his publication of the short recension of the three-letter collection of the Ignatian epistles. And he did this in 3 volumes, an original publication just of the manuscripts, then Vindice Ignatius, which was a follow-up that argued for their authenticity over the 7 letters in the middle recension, and then Corpus Ignatianum in 1849, which we're going to come on to a bit later. He continued his work and eventually retired back up to Shropshire. Although even once he retired, the bug didn't leave him, as it were. He was still entrenched in scholarly pursuits. So he went back up to to Shropshire, where he was born, with his wife, and lived in a place called Brooke House. And I've got a fun story about that. But um, he then died in 1864 following a short illness which he suffered from a railway accident. The precise details I couldn't find out. So he's become a real side passion of mine over the last few months, and there's all the details roughly that I can find out about him. But in addition to that, I went over and found the church whose parish boundary he was in Shropshire. And it's a lovely church called St Mary's. It's in Westbury, which is a tiny little village. And for those of you who know Shrewsbury, it's not very far away. And I rang the church and I said, "Excuse me, do you know if William Cureton is buried here?" And a lovely lady answered the phone. She said, "I don't really know, but I know he lived here." And further to that, there's a street name just opposite the church called Cureton Close. So we know that he lived there. And we also know that he used to live in the old vicarage for that church. And one of the beautiful things about that is that the woman that I called also used to live in that house. It's been turned into flats, but she didn't know that he lived there either. So we're currently trying to find his graveyard, sorry, his tombstone in the graveyard. And when we do, I'm going to go up and take pictures of it, and I'll be sure to post them on all of my social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So he died, and he was outlived by his wife Harriet, who was presented at the funeral with a portrait of him by the community. They loved him so much, and they thought he was such a good man that they paid the money to have a picture drawn of him, which I have a copy of here, and I hope that sort of shows up on the screen. All right, um, and next to it you'll see a letter which I purchased last month. Now this letter is the only work I can find, or only signature of Cureton I can find at this moment, um, that he has ever written. And it's a letter that he wrote to someone who's interested in buying one of his most influential books, the excuse my Latin pronunciation here, the Spic Elegium Sicarum. And this guy reached out and said to him, "Hi, where can I buy your book?" And Cureton responds with this hastily drawn letter. So it's the only one I can find, and I saw it, and it was only £30. I thought I need to have that. I'm a poor student. I haven't got any money, but I'd rather not eat for 2 weeks and have this. Just because I am eating, don't worry at home if mum's listening. But you see the point, right? This is a special thing, and so I bought it, got them doubly framed, and now he's here. One of the things that I love, though, is that he was clearly loved when he was alive, both by his wife. I can't find any information out about his children. I'd love to trace his family line, but the fact he was loved so much by the community, is quite is striking to me. So, with that short biography then out of the way, let's get to some of the meat of this great um, work that he produced on the Ignatian epistles. I want to tell you the story though from the beginning, and I'm sure a few of you might have seen my videos on History Valley or other podcasts where I've talked about the Ignatian epistles, but we've never talked about how this Syriac recension came to light. And the reason for that was because I didn't think it'd be that interesting to people. However, it turns out that apparently, according to some of the people that have reached out to me, this is exactly what you wanted to hear about. Where did the manuscripts come from? What's the story behind them? And how do we know where they came from and all the rest of it? So I thought I'd share with you, um, in a summarized version, the words of Cureton in this book, Corpus Ignatianum, as he tells it, because it's the most special account of any discovery I've ever seen. But before that, we've got to jump almost 150 years before Cureton begins his work with a man called Dr. Fell. Now, Dr. Fell was around in the 1670s, and he wanted to find more manuscripts for the Ignatian epistles. He knew they were out there because the Metropolitan of Sober, a man by the name of Ebed Jesu, wrote that he had seen them and that they were around. So Dr. Fell really, really, really thought, I know these are out there and I want them. And so he reached out to Robert Huntington, who was in Aleppo with the British government. And Huntington obliged with great zeal and wrote to two of the Eastern bishops asking them if he knew of their whereabouts. And I don't know if he got replies, but in the end, he ended up going to a place called St. Mary de Apara, again, excuse my pronunciation, in the Nitrian desert. Now, this monastery had many, many great volumes, and we'll see where some of those volumes end up in a moment. But the most important volume they had there was three copies, or three manuscripts, I should say, of the Ignatian epistles. Not one, not two, but three. They had a manuscript that was just of Ignatius Polycarp, Ignatius Letter Polycarp, and then they had two more that had three epistles: Ignatius to Polycarp, to Romans, and to the Ephesians. And Huntington has now travelled from Aleppo. He's in Egypt in the desert. He's been given lots of money to do this, and he probably stands within a few feet of them. But the monks of the monastery did not show them to him. He had no idea they were there. He left thinking that they probably weren't. And that is a horrific sadness now looking back. He never lived to see that happen, that they were found there. But imagine if he found out, gosh, you just want to, oh, who knows? You'd want to just fall over and cry. But what did come out of the Nitrian desert in this monastery a few years later was some fragments that were purchased by another chap at the time of Cureton. And Cureton translated them. Now, what they were the acts of martyrdom for various saints and martyrs, all loaded in together, several of them. And inside there was Ignatius' letter to the Romans. So for the first time, Cureton knew that there was something, that Huntington's suspicion was right, and that there was something there, and he hoped there'd be more. In the meantime, he was informed that the Vatican also had another manuscript enumerating several acts of martyrdom, and he hoped that he would find Ignatius' acts of martyrdom inside, again with Romans in it. So he reached out to the Vatican because he was told on good authority, and he doesn't tell us who the authority is, that it was in the Vatican. Well, the Vatican says and maintained to him, despite his good authority, that they never had such a manuscript. Whether they didn't want to give it to him because it showed the 3-letter collection rather than the 7 that they wanted to accept as genuine, or whether they just were incompetent and didn't know how to catalogue stuff properly, or whether they just genuinely didn't have it, I don't know. But Cureton was clearly very frustrated by this, and a bit upset as well because he tried very hard for this. But, his sadness was only temporary. For in 1838 and 1839, a man by the name of Henry Tatham went to Egypt to look for these manuscripts on behalf of Cureton, and they secured money from the government to do this. I mentioned earlier, my man Cureton was hobnobbing with some of the most prominent people in England, and the Lord's Treasury paid for this expedition of Tatham. See, friends in high places, that's what you got to have. And so, Henry Tatham comes back and he procures several Syriac manuscripts from the monastery that Huntington was in, and lo and behold, Huntington's mistake was Tatham's joy because Tatham found them. And I want to quote this from Cureton because he writes that as soon as Tatham returned and deposited the manuscripts, he basically ran down there. He doesn't look like a runner based on his pictures, but I can only imagine his excitement. And he says this: I rejoice to discover not only several extracts from the epistles cited by different ecclesiastical writers, but also the entire epistle to St. Polycarp in a volume of great antiquity. Now, bear in mind, at this point, he's only found one of the 3 that are going to come. But he says, I rejoice to discover. I could only imagine his heart rate. If he had his Pixel watch or his Galaxy watch on, or his Apple Watch, better cover all the brands, I can only imagine that his heart rate would have been 150 through the roof, almost close to resuscitation. I was saying to someone just the other day that if I found an Ignatian manuscript, I don't think I'd be able to recover for months. This is the sort of thing we get off on as scholars. But Cureton said, being as diligent as he is and as persistent as he is, he never gives up. He said, I know that there are more, because he also referred back to the Metropolitan's Ebu Jesu, Ebed Jesu, apologies. He referred back to that and knew there were more than one copy. So he sent Tatham back. And in 1842, Tatham returned, this time with 300 to 400 volumes. 300 to 400 volumes, which he purchased from them. And bear in mind, we're still not done. There's still loads of stuff left at this point, manuscripts, evidences, codexes in the monastery. So 300 or 400 volumes come back, we're not finished. And this time, again, I have to quote Cureton again. He says, I had the rare satisfaction of having my hopes realized by finding among them not only several additional passages from Ignatius quoted by various authors, but also 3 entire epistles to Polycarp, the Ephesians, and the Romans in a volume of a very considerable antiquity. The joy that he experienced last time was probably magnified tenfold this time, or at least threefold. Rather than 1 letter, he finds 3. Unbelievable. Then, in 1847, a merchant named August Pacho bought the rest of the volumes in Tatham's library. That Tatham had not bought, from the Latrian Deserts library. And within them, He then came back and said, I found more of these Ignatian business. Do you want it? And again, the Lord Commissioner of Her Majesty's Treasury gave Cureton the money to purchase all of these other codices and manuscripts. And again, he had the joy of discovering 3 epistles in the short recension. I should mention that all of the manuscripts attest to the short recension, whether it be the Polycarp or the 2 sets of 3s. This one, however, the beauty of this one was dated not by its author, but by the gentleman who donated it to the monastery in 931 AD by a guy called Moses of Nisibis, who apparently got the manuscript from Baghdad. So we now have all the manuscripts together, and Cureton publishes them all together and begins to explain why these must be the genuine epistles. And his argument is essentially threefold. He says the early attestations of the Ignatian manuscripts all refer to the Syriac collection, number one. Number two, he suggests that there's going to be no reason why someone would take some of the stuff out of the middle recension because it was things like Jesus' resurrection. Who would take that out to make a new collection of 3 letters? And the last one was that he argued that there were some stylistic and grammatical differences and lexicographical differences, things that I've now taken to the extreme and researched more thoroughly than he ever had time to. And so, for a short time, Cureton's thesis was accepted. He did really well. Bunsen, Lee, Christopher Wordsworth, they all backed him. They all agreed. That wasn't until in 1873 when Zahn produced his book on the Ignatian manuscripts. Now, by this point, I should say that Cureton had already passed away 10 years earlier in 1863. So he never lived to see his work be destroyed and disrespected. Well, I won't say disrespected per se, but overthrown as the consensus. And Zahn essentially argued that there was good reason to believe the middle recension based on some commonalities and similarities between parts that are exclusive to the 3-letter collection and parts that are exclusive to the 7 letters. And he says, well, it's quite clear that they're from the same author. But the real work to crush Cureton and make him the subject only of mere footnotes, if he's lucky, by future scholars, was that of J.B. Lightfoot. And in 1885, he published 3 volumes in several parts to each volume as well, against Cureton and the Ignatian epistles in the 3-letter collection. He argued, very ineffectively in my opinion, that similar to Zahn, there were stylistic elements that were all over the Ignatian epistles, and he gives a 17-page list of similarities between the 2 collections. And some of these connections of thought that he suggests are barely even that. Some of them are literally just one word the same, and it won't even be a significant word. Others are a bit more convincing, but not enough. He also tries to argue that it's the 7-letter collection that's attested rather than the 3, i.e. the middle over the short recension. But again, I've shown in my thesis that this comes up short. But regardless of all of this, Zahn and Lightfoot and their consensus has for the last 50 years now been the consensus. Every scholar who has dealt with the Ignatian epistles since Lightfoot, with the exception of maybe 2, a guy called Robert Joly and Marcus Vincent, and now me obviously, has only considered the Ignatian epistles in the middle recension of the 7-letter collection. Whether they believe them to be forgeries or the genuine article, nobody has ever looked at the epistles individually, looking at the merits, styles, lexicons, grammar of each one on its own, and treated it as an independent article. For everyone else, they rise and fall purely based on the middle recension. Now, I mentioned the other day in a podcast I did with Jacob that actually the middle recension of the 7-letter collection doesn't actually exist, except in the fantasies of those who wish to advocate for its authenticity. Because if you want to find the middle recension, the only codices or manuscripts, sorry, that we have of it don't just attest the 7 letters. 6 other letters are attested alongside them. So when people say, it's a 7 letter collection, yeah, but hold on. Because no manuscript ever just attests 7. They always pair them with the other 6. Additionally, if you ever want to find 7 letters just on their own, i.e., the 7 that are perceived to be genuine, they are only attested in the long recension, not the middle. So, what you have to do as an advocate for the 7 letters is amalgamate the manuscript evidence to suit your agenda. There is no manuscript that attests their version of the epistles. And further to that, Lightfoot on several occasions even argues against the 7 letter collection and the middle recension on certain readings, choosing the reading of the long recension or the short recension, or even the Arabic recension or the Simeon Metaphrastes recension. Even he cannot choose sometimes which one he wants. And so this is where we are now with scholarship. Is essentially we don't have any scholars working on the 3 letter collection currently in the world except me, as far as I'm aware. If you know any more, please reach them out to me. I think it's really important, and as does Marcus Vincent, that we pay tribute to William Cureton in our work. The reality is that without him and his contribution, and also of Bunsen and Wordsworth and all those other fellows too, we wouldn't be where we are. And although, like I said, Cureton never lived to see his his theory go, I would like him. I'd like to think that he could now look down and say, "I'm getting the attention it deserves, and I've been vindicated," rather than vindicate Ignatius, vindicate Cureton. So this is basically the summary of his life and his major works. I'm yet to read some of his other works, and so hopefully when I do that, I might be able to come back to you with even more. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Please go subscribe to my Patreon and to this channel. Give it a like, and also follow me on Twitter. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'd love to chat with some of you, and hopefully in more live streams in the future, there'll be more of you online, and we can have a bit of a interaction going. Thank you very much, and I bid you all a very good night.